We're live. Welcome everyone. Welcome Forward readers. Thank you all for being here. My name is Lewis Keene, and I'm a staff writer for The Forward. I'm thrilled this evening to be hosting veteran investigative journalist Eric Lichtblau to discuss his new book, American Reich, A Murder in Orange County, Neo-Nazis, and a New Age of Hate. Eric is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner for his reporting at the New York Times. He previously worked at the LA Times, where one of the beats he covered was hate crime in Southern California. He's also the author of The Nazis Next Door, which tells the story of Nazi resettlement in the US after World War II. This book, American Reich, centers on the January 2018 murder of Blaze Bernstein, a gay and Jewish college student from Orange County, by a neo-Nazi he had attended high school with named Sam Woodward. The book situates Woodward's path into radicalization with the neo-Nazi group Atomwaffen Division in the context of the broader rebirth of far-right extremism in the US, and especially in Orange County. I covered the Woodward trial for The Forward, spending several weeks in a Santa Ana courtroom as prosecution and defense spun a tale of two Orange County families, one liberal and Jewish and one Catholic and conservative, who were linked by the crime committed by one son against the other. Blaze's Reconstructionist Jewish upbringing was explored during the trial, as were the religious strictures of the household Woodward grew up in. After a nearly 3-month trial, Woodward was convicted of murder and a hate crime and was sentenced in 2024 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Blaze Bernstein's parents have become LGBTQ advocates and created a scholarship fund to honor the memory of their son. I still believe that this story is instructive, especially considering the recent mainstreaming of neo-Nazi ideology, the recrudescence of Christian anti-Semitism, and the re-election of President Donald Trump. Eric's deeply researched book stares right into the gaping maw of our scary new reality so that we can better understand it. Thank you for joining us this evening, Eric.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for doing this event. It's such an important topic. Thank you.
American Reich tells the stories not just of Blaze Bernstein and Sam Woodward, but of several hate crimes that have happened across the US in the last 15 or so years, including 3 murders that involved the Atomwaffen Division, which was the group that Sam Woodward was a part of. So what made you want to focus on Orange County and the Blaze Bernstein case in particular as the narrative thread that sort of takes this whole book together?
Yeah, it's a national story. We're in the midst of a nationwide epidemic of hate crimes and the resurgence of white supremacy, but we wanted to really localize it to give people the sense of what it was like at a really grounded level. And in doing that, wanted to focus on one particular place and one particular case as best we could. And maybe do that in a way that was surprising in some ways, not your typical deep South place where one might expect the sense of deep-seated bigotry. And Orange County kind of fit that bill in a lot of ways because it has grappled with white supremacy for a long time, and it was surprising in a lot of ways. And so my editor and I, in deciding how to shape the book, were drawn by a lot of elements in Orange County and in the tragedy of Blaze Bernstein's death. The killer being Sam Woodward, someone who'd become radicalized and drawn into the neo-Nazi movement, first online and then in person. He traveled to hate camp in Texas. He became deeper and deeper enmeshed in the neo-Nazi movement. He met with this elder statesman just before the killing of Blaze Bernstein, a guy named James Mason, who I interviewed extensively for my book. He, as I said, went to Texas to join in this horrible hate camp. He kept this diary of hate. He really sort of embodied, a kid who just became sucked deeper and deeper into this movement. And in Orange County became sort of the face of how a kid became, a poster child for neo-Nazism. And Orange County itself was going through just these growing pains of hatred with a bunch of different groups, not just Atomwaffen, which was the group that Sam Woodward joined, but another group was the Rise Above movement, a very different kind of mindset. These were street brawlers, hand-to-hand combat, guys who would train on the beach for basically beating the crap out of minorities and Antifa members. There were a bunch of other different white supremacists that the county was struggling with as liberals and Democrats were taking over seats in Congress, and white conservatives were facing this challenge to their years and years of authority behind the Orange Curtain. So it was really kind of a petri dish for how white supremacy was going through this test of its long held leadership, and the threat that it was under, and the violence that was coming from it in terms of pushing to hold its grip on a place like Orange County.
Yeah, there's this picture of neo-Nazis in the cultural imagination. I think, at least for me, like descends from movies like American History X, which of course takes place in Southern California. It's
Yeah,
based on a group in San Diego.
yeah.
But like, what distinguishes this? I mean, is there one thing that distinguishes this era of neo-Nazis, this new age of hate, um, from the American History X sort of paradigm, or maybe
Well,
there's multiple.
certainly the internet. I mean, that distinguishes it from past generations, in a completely different way in terms of the ability to get their message out, in recruitment, in operations, the ease with which they're able to spread their message, to attract new members. Um, uh, the guardrails that used to prevent hate speech from getting out, for instance, have now been chopped down to almost nothing on social media. And while there's the need for some of these hate groups to still use encrypted channels like Parler and Gab and Telegram and things like that. They now can go to just mainstream sites to get their hateful messages out, because it's become so easy. So it used to be a generation or two or three ago that they were passing messages in paper bags, or from house to house. Now they're doing it so easily through the internet, and that's allowed them to grow by leaps and bounds. That's certainly the fundamental difference from this day and age versus 20 or 30 years ago.
You mentioned James Mason earlier. He's not a household name like David Duke or Richard Spencer even,
He's not, no.
but he's arguably had like greater influence than either of them on contemporary hate groups. So
He
tell us a little
has.
bit more about James Mason, and why what is his philosophy, and like how did that find a grip on today's era of neo-Nazis?
Yeah, and he's also somewhat tied to both the growth of the internet and also, unfortunately, to Sam Woodward. He's a guy who he's in his mid 70s now, and he's been involved in the neo-Nazi movement since the 1960s, 1970s. But he had a falling out with the Nazi movement. He was considered too extreme for even neo-Nazis, believe it or not. And he was sort of a cast-off for a couple of reasons, both because he was convicted on child porn and pedophilia charges, so that was a bit taboo even in some neo-Nazi circles. And he was also buddies with Charles Manson, which was a bridge too far also in some circles. So there were some taboo subjects even for them. These days, that may seem ironic. So he went off to Denver and was an outcast in the movement for years and years and years. But then this younger generation of neo-Nazis, as they began their resurgence about 10 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, just as the online neo-Nazis and white supremacists really began taking off. Groups like Iron March, which was a huge online forum for white supremacists, began surging, discovered him, and put his writings, a book called Siege, which is this horrible racist screed against Jews and blacks and other minorities, but mostly Jews and blacks, putting that online and made it required reading for their membership. And that took off. Read Siege became like a mantra, a viral directive for groups like Atomwaffen and many other groups. And that became a recruitment tool. And he found a second life. And kids like Sam Woodward in their teens and early 20s began flocking to Colorado to see him in person. This became like a mecca, a rite of pilgrimage, as I write in the book. And I talked to him at some length. I tracked him down. He wasn't real happy to see me at first, but eventually he spoke with me. And they would go in the middle of the night. They would coordinate with him through these encrypted channels in advance to see him, and they would get selfies taken with him with the great James Mason, who they saw as this truth teller about the coming race war, or someone who was willing to stand up for the white man. And they would sometimes get a copy of his book back in hard copy, signed. And in Sam Woodward's case, he then went on to kill Blaze Bernstein soon after this. Others went on to violence after contact with James Mason, and he's become this hero to a new generation of white supremacists. He tells them, he doesn't condone violence because he knows the FBI is probably listening to his phones and his meetings. But if you're going to commit violence, go big. That's what he tells them. And he's
Why
this
did you
horrible spiritual guru.
why did you want to go meet him? What were you
Well,
hoping to
because
get
he's
out of the
become
book?
such an influential figure that as sordid a figure as he is, it's a necessary evil that I wanted to understand the message that he's telling these kids and understand what the poison that he's feeding them.
Yeah. Well, so he didn't testify during the trial, but two former neo-Nazis who had left Atomwaffen
Yeah,
did, and they gave conflicting descriptions of Atomwaffen under oath. One of them depicted the group as a genuinely violent and dangerous group. He testified under a pseudonym.
yeah,
The other used his government name. He said, I'm not afraid of these guys. They're all posers."
yeah.
So, and of course, Samuel Woodward was a member and committed murder. So, how do you square those two very different depictions of this group?
Yeah, well, there's probably some truth to both. I mean, not all members of Atomwaffen go on to commit violence. Some of them did stay on the non-violent side of the law, and guys like Sam Woodward did go on to commit violence. So some of them are just sort of the braggarts who want to puff out their chests and scare the hell out of people. Others are going to snap. It's tough to know who's gonna be on which side of that line. But certainly there are upwards of, by my count, about 25 or 30 of them who have crossed that line and been prosecuted are in state or federal prisons right now. They've committed acts of violence. They've committed swatting operations and doxing operations where they threaten crimes. They call the cops on people, sending the cops out to their homes in emergency situations. They've threatened extortion. They've committed hate crimes against minorities. They've committed a whole long list of violent and nonviolent acts of extortion. So there's a long list of crimes connected to them. There's probably the majority of them are connected to crimes at this point.
Wow. Yeah, I understood that the Atomwaffen sort of collapsed after Sam Woodward's arrest, more or less. But where are they
They
now?
did,
They sort of
they officially disbanded, but a lot of them just went off to form new groups under other names. But there was just a guy in Florida just about a month ago who was arrested with an Atomwaffen banner. He was indicted by state authorities and was preparing to commit new crimes,
Uh,
in 2026. So, they're still out there. And the original founder who was there for that double homicide that you mentioned, he was arrested all over again just about a year ago for trying to bring down the power grid in Baltimore with his girlfriend, his neo-Nazi girlfriend. He got out of prison once after that double homicide on explosive charges, and then he was arrested. He was barely out of prison the first time, and he got arrested a second time for plotting a race war in Baltimore by bringing down the power grid. So
hmm, yeah. Um,
not good people.
yeah, and I think one thing your book picks up on is like a lot of them are just are kids. They're teenagers,
Yeah,
they're lost people in their early 20s. Um, and they fall into these like holes basically, and they spiral into eventually committing violence.
yeah.
And Sam Woodward is definitely in the category of a vulnerable um, teenager when he goes off to college and he can't hack it in college, and he's bullied at home. And I don't know, that was one of the things I found compelling about the trial was like some of the things that Woodward, who definitely killed this guy, stabbed him to death, stabbed him 28 times.
Yeah.
Um, that he had in common with Blaze, in spite of them being, very different people. They were both transitioning, they were both struggling to transition into adulthood. Blaze like didn't come out during high school. He struggled to talk to his parents about it. He had taken a semester off from UPenn. Sam, on the other hand, he also had no friends in high school. He dropped out of college. During the trial, his mom talked about, bringing him medication to school because he wasn't capable of getting it on his own.
Hmm.
Uh, why do you think Woodward turned out the way he did? And like, do you think there's any lessons here for us? I don't know.
Well, Woodward was clearly a very troubled, disaffected kid. He was almost the stereotype of the brooding loner, as you say, very few kids. He developed a few friends apparently in college, but then dropped out. And he's the kind of kid that the neo-Nazis aim to recruit. They're ex-neo-Nazis who have written playbooks or talked about the playbooks that are written for how to find kids just like Sam Woodward, the alienated youth who are seeking a community. As sad as that is, they're looking for a cause. The white supremacy fills a void in their lives, of all strange things. And when you look at Woodward's writings, he was more passionate about white supremacy than anything in his life. He found that he wrote that, this gave him a purpose he had never felt before in his life. He wrote to his other Adamoff and friend in their texts, that he had never felt as strongly about anything in his life. When his friend says, it's not too late to turn around now, he's like, nope, nope, I've never felt anything this strongly. I want to go ahead and join this group, and I know exactly what I'm doing. And he really believed passionately about this. He wanted to be accepted, and it's almost like they were looking for a kid just like this who wanted just to belong. And he, Woodward, as you know, took the stand in his own defense, which is fairly unusual in a murder trial. And he tried to sort of write that off in his testimony and say, well, I wasn't really talking about white supremacy or violence. I just wanted to belong. He tried to kind of sugarcoat all that, but it was a little tough to do with all the horrible things that he had written in his diary and in those texts. When you're talking about all the things in his diary about hating Jews and hating blacks and all the memes and things that they had found, there was a lot of stuff that he had to try and paper over that was very difficult to do. It wasn't just about belonging in community. There was a lot of hatred in there that was tough to explain away. So he was a very troubled kid, and he certainly fell in with a bunch of guys who were looking for someone just like him to serve their own purposes. James Mason, to come back to James Mason, has written for years about uh, packs of white supremacists using lone wolves, people like really Sam Woodward, to commit their crimes and acts of violence. You know, the pack sending off these lone wolves. So he was kind of a perfect lone wolf for to fling out of the pack and commit an act of violence. And when he did what he did, you know, the response from the rest of Atomwaffen was horrible and revolting, you know, in their own encrypted messages that later leaked out. You know, there were messages like, you know, that Sam Woodward had become a gay Jew wrecking crew was one of them. That was, I believe, that was read in court, and you know, he was celebrated for having the act of violence. And Mason himself, you know, said because he thought that you know, he didn't believe it was just worth it to swap one man for one life. He thought you should just go big. It wasn't worth just killing one gay Jew, is what he told me afterwards. As sickening a thought as that is, that you know, Woodward should have killed lots of people. It wasn't worth just killing one person. That was a waste. You know, he should have killed lots of people, is what he should have done if he was really going to listen to the James Mason playbook. So it was a waste.
And Mason wasn't entertaining Sam's defense at all, that he was provoked in the
No,
moment by something that Blaze did. He was, yeah.
no, no.
Um, yeah. Oh, so one thing I thought worked really well in the book was your connection of this groundswell of hate in Orange County specifically to some of the political upheaval in Washington,
Hmm.
and which you sort of describe as like working in this feedback loop where you have like
Hmm.
things that are happening in Washington are like maybe encouraging, you know, words coming out of the White House, or from the campaign trail are sort of accelerating this uh,
Yeah,
hateful sentiment against immigrations, against immigrants, against minorities.
sure.
And also you have you know, the neo-Nazi activity also maybe shaping federal policy or federal idea or just sort of national ideas. Um, and you connected that even to January 6th, which I found super
Mhm.
interesting. Did you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we've been in this 10-year cycle, this surge in hate crimes nationally now. The hate crimes are at record highs since the FBI began tracking them in the early 1990s, the highest levels they've been at, and the worst of all the hate crimes are at the hands of really card-carrying white supremacists, with obviously the worst slaughter of Jews ever on American soil in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life, the worst ever, I'm sorry, the worst in modern history against blacks in Buffalo a couple of years ago, surpassing the one at the church in South Carolina. You can go on and on. The worst against Hispanics by a white supremacist in El Paso at the Walmart. All of those in recent years. You know, you don't have to go back to the 1960s, the bloodshed of the civil rights movement. These are all in the last few years or so. And we're really in this epidemic of hatred, and it's a frenzy of violent bigotry, you know, stemming from a lot of it is the rhetoric out of Washington, and you know, I put a lot of the blame for that at Trump's doorstep, to be honest. You know, as do many of the scholars and experts that I talk to. It's no coincidence that the surge began in 2015, which is the same year that Trump began his candidacy for the White House. Of course, he announced his candidacy with the speech after he came down the golden escalator at Trump Tower. His very first remarks were blaming Mexican rapists and immigrants in this xenophobic tone-setting talk, and that would, of course, you know, set the stage for what was to come. And it That rhetoric has gotten sharper and sharper and sharper since then. And the his he has given, his energy has fed and fueled the white supremacist from the good people on both sides of Charlottesville on, and the white supremacists in turn have bolstered him, and it's been this ugly cycle back and forth, and that continues um, to this day. I mean, I could talk for half an hour just about that, but the cat eating, dog eating Haitians, which I'm sure most of your readers remember from Ohio at the campaign. What they probably don't know, in the first place, was that was a debunked myth about there never were any cat eating or dog eating Haitians in Ohio. But that was a debunked myth that was started by neo-Nazis, a neo-Nazi group called the Blood Order in Ohio, who were thrilled by the attention that their debunked rumor was now getting. When the president and J.D. Vance picked up on that, they said, "Can you believe it? The president is now talking about that. This is what real influence is like." That was what they said in one of their encrypted channels. Same with the new policy a few months back to allow white South Afrikaners in the US at the same time when we're blocking virtually every other country, especially those with people of color, from coming in the United States. That policy of allowing in tens of thousands of white South Afrikaners is based on a debunked myth started by white supremacists, and also with Elon Musk whispering in Trump's ear about blacks killing white South Afrikaners. Like the cat-eating Haitians, it's not true. But that's what Trump believes, and that's how it gets perpetuated. Again, this empowering of white supremacist myths it has led to policies and racist policies and actions.
There's a remarkable statistic that you cite here about January 6th and who participated in January 6th. There was a uh, overrepresentation of people from Orange County specifically, but more broadly, there was a trend that I found really interesting that I want you to share.
Yeah, yeah. We wrongly think of who was at January 6th at the rioting there as being people from the reddest of states, kind of the Trump country. And there was a fascinating study done at the University of Chicago that found that wasn't really so. It was really the places that were undergoing change the fastest. And it was really talking about places like Orange County, where the Democrats actually just a few years earlier had taken over the Democratic seats in Congress, which in the Orange Curtain, if you know the history of Orange County, was once unthinkable. This is a place where Orange County Republicans had dominated for generations and generations. So it was really a place where Republicans were fighting for their lives, and it just lost all the seats. And so it was purple, if anything. And so what you had was this place in political tumult, and Orange County sent 18 people who got arrested at January 6th, which is a huge number considering traveling 3,000 miles away. And you had white nationalists who were sitting there up at the dais, a college student there with his white nationalist flag up there at Nancy Pelosi's desk, and on, a bunch of people there who were, breaking through the windows and gallivanting around. We tend to sort of forget how many white supremacists were there that day, with wearing 6 million wasn't enough, or Camp Auschwitz or Confederate flags. It was, I think it's become sort of minimized. That was chiefly, of course, an effort to stop Biden from being certified as the next president. But secondarily, it was really an affirmation of white power for a lot of the white nationalists who were there in dominant numbers, including Orange County.
That dovetails with something that you quote Sam Woodward saying early in the book when he's in high school. He says, it's really bothering me that there's this mixed race that's becoming real, and there's like nowhere that's more Well, in Orange County, and especially specifically in his high school, which is a very liberal place,
Yeah,
with like I think in the trial they said maybe a third of the kids were identifying as LGBT,
yeah,
and he personally was struggling, seemed to be struggling with his sexuality on some level, and is trying to find his own place. And you could
yeah.
see how, lashing out against that um, would be appealing to him as a way to sort of, I guess, make sense or to respond to the the internal struggle he was having.
Yeah, yeah. He ended up at this very LGBT friendly arts high school. His dad didn't want him there, his mom did, but that probably, if anything, kind of sped his descent into white supremacy because he just ended up hating almost everyone around him, unfortunately, which was he then transferred to a
Public high
more
school.
traditional Newport Beach high school and still ended up hating everyone. So
Yeah.
very sad.
So toward the end of the book, you introduce the neo-Nazi landscape of Trump's second term, which is even, I think, a little bit different. It's evolved from the 2010 to 2020, let's say, era
Yeah.
in here. Um, I think that's a good place to sort of lead us into the Q&A, which is or the audience Q&A, which is how does like the Nick Fuentes set and the Groypers, um, and these Twitch influencers, how do they compare to the kind of organizing and activity and even the philosophy that characterized the neo-Nazis of this book and especially the Trump first term, and how does the threat profile compare between one and the other?
Yeah. Well, Nick Fuentes seems to be trying to take on the mantle of Charlie Kirk since he was killed, and seems to be kind of mainstreaming his rhetoric a little bit, making himself a little bit more palatable in some ways. Of course, he was a buddy of Trump, still is, dined with him at Mar-a-Lago, has said every horrible thing under the sun on the night of Trump's election. He went viral with a tweet that would have been banned on X a year or so ago before they lowered their standards even further, saying that announcing to the women of the world that what a great night this was for Trump's reelection, and that to the women that bitch, your body is mine, a misogynistic declaration to all the women of the world. And this sort of new alpha male bro thing that he and other men seem to be putting forward. I think that he's a more public version of some of the other neo-Nazis that are still keeping a lower profile. He wants to be to maintain that higher profile the way Charlie Kirk did. And so he wants to have the exposure. So he's sort of flirting with that with the public streak to see how that goes. And so far, it seems to have done him pretty well. I think that we've seen Trump in his own rhetoric just going even further than he ever did in his first term. I mean, he's been willing to say and do things that he was unwilling to do the first time around, like, shithole countries, for instance. He would only say that privately behind closed doors, and then that would leak out. Now he says that stuff publicly. There are a bunch of examples of that, of things that he is now willing to say that he would never actually say publicly before. in terms of his denigration of of various groups. But his just dehumanizing rhetoric beginning towards the end of the campaign and into the start of his first year, certainly at the end of the campaign, the main focus was of immigrants and of trans people with his ads that were not only dehumanizing but just outright false. These claims of trans kids who were walking in, either a boy or a girl, and then leaving school, the opposite gender, of course, which never happened. Like many of things that Trump claims, just completely false. And throwing in for good measure many of his talks, Hitler-esque language, poisoning the blood of the country, and laughing at people who says, "Are you sure you want to use that, language straight from Hitler?" And just sort of taunting them. The Times did a story just last week, probably the 100th story that someone has done about DHS and other places using Nazi-like language, and in their in uh, uh, either songs, or I forget which one it was last week, because that story has been done so many times now. But there's, after the first or second or third time, maybe you can claim it's just accidental that they're echoing the Nazi language. But after the 10th or 20th time, I don't think you can really claim it's an accident. And there was something a few months ago where the guy on Fox, he claims to be a satirist, Greg Gutman is his name, I think, where he actually with a straight face got in the air and said, we should embrace the Nazi name, the way the blacks did with the N-word. And even his co-host looked at him like he was crazy, and he was not joking. I put this in the epilogue of the book, and he said, they embrace the N-word, we should embrace Nazi. Call ourselves Nazi. And he repeated this over and over again, and you could just see his ghost, like their jaws were dropped. And then you saw those emails leak out from the young RNC about 2 months ago. I unfortunately couldn't get this in the epilogue of the book. It was too late for my deadline. But where they were all laughing with each other in their emails, saying, "Yeah, I've got a little bit of Hitler in me." So it's not even necessarily the card-carrying neo-Nazis, but even it's the mainstreaming a lot of these of the Republican establishment, who were sort of claiming their neo-Nazi loyalties, often parroting what Trump himself is saying.
So we have a couple questions coming in from the Q&A. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. I'll start with a question from Robin, which is who says she devoured the book in 3 days. Fantastic, but so disturbing. What are your
Okay.
hopes and fears going forward with our president continuing to spew hateful rhetoric? And I know you've sort of answered part of this, but um, I thought this book was very grim. But I'm wondering if you found any sort of silver linings or things that you found maybe uplifting about a response to this, or something that you found that's been working um, in terms of combating this rise.
There were a few glimmers of optimism that I included in the book, from Orange County. There were a couple of things from Virginia where you found community members coming to the aid of victims of persecution and hatred, oftentimes when the authorities wouldn't step in. There was an incident in Orange County where an Asian family was really harassed mercilessly for months by really what were just teenagers, 13, 14, 15 years old, in the middle of COVID. It started just with ringing the doorbell at all hours of the night, but then it escalated to throwing rocks and all sorts of horrible names at them, leaving like pornography all sorts of other things, to the point that the father put up a whole new security system, video, a gate around the place, and calling the cops over and over again, and the cops would not do anything. And then finally, the neighborhood set up their own little neighborhood watch, where you had, and a local assemblyman came, and the neighbors would stand guard to try and ward these kids off. And there were several confrontations. It got pretty ugly, but in the end, it worked. And it made you realize that sometimes the good guys can win out. And there was a similar thing in not far from me in Washington, where I am, but in Virginia, where it was a military family, a biracial family that was being harassed by a next door neighbor who was, every time they left, there was an audio video system that would spew out, like, I don't even want to say it almost. It was these horrible, like, monkey noises and racist stuff. And again, the community, the cops wouldn't do anything. And the community turned out and sort of shamed him into stopping. And so it was the same sort of thing. And people did the right thing. And in the end, the families got some peace. There were enough situations of that it made you realize people did care about the victims. And you hear about that, and the public spotlight ended up helping the victims. So I think people do care about these things when they find out about it, and even when the authorities can be maddeningly slow to do something, um, sometimes the right thing can happen.
Yeah. Um, there's so many good questions here. Okay, here's a question. So is there a particular hate group that you think is more dangerous than the others? And I'll try to um, put a spin on this also, which is, in 2017, we didn't know what atomwaffen was, but it turned out they were, I mean, maybe a few people knew, but they weren't known.
Right.
Um, is there an atomwaffen of 2026 that we should be aware of, that you've encountered or
That's a good question. There might be one right now that we're not even aware of yet, like the, the base, or who are the next, the order, or that's an excellent question. And it's tough to say what the answer is. There's none that pops to mind. There's so many. I mean, by the count of the Southern Poverty Law Center, a year or two ago, we reached like an all-time high just in white supremacist groups of about 165. That was a record high. So it's more just the numbers of disparate groups than any one or two or three being the most extreme. You can find sort of, like Sam Woodward, who sort of went looking, he sort of tried on different groups, and that before finding Atomwaffen, the one that fit him most. If you're into Christian identity, you can find this one. If you're into explosives, you can find another one. If you're into hand-to-hand combat, you can find the Rise Above movement. You can find, there's no one size fits all, and you can find something that fits you. So if you're into drugs, there's other ones. So it's just sort of the scale and enormity of the different groups that's really kind of the most worrisome at this point.
yeah. There's a question here from Karen Hirsch, which is, why do you think the people still involved in white supremacy, Mason, and there were others, were willing to talk to you? And I'm going to add to that, like, were you ever worried that they were going to come after you?
Yeah, Mason at first was certainly not willing to talk to me, and I don't know. After a while, I guess I just he by the end he fancies himself an intellectual, so I guess I was willing to hear him talk enough that he wanted to impress me with how smart he was and how much he knew about world history. He's a high school dropout, and so he wanted to impress me with that. My wife was picking me up on the way to the airport as I was interviewing, my phone died. So she was a little worried when she couldn't reach me and she knew I was with this guy. So she was a little bit more worried than I was. But yeah, I take precautions and so there's always a little bit of concern. They've certainly gone after some journalists. I talk in the book about one guy name of A.C. Thompson who was at ProPublica, and he really did tremendous amount of groundbreaking work on these groups after the rise above violence in 2017, and Adam Moffat and other groups went after him for that. So, there's always a concern. So I, sort of watch my back, but hopefully not. So
Mhm. Samuel Shepard asks, what is your relationship like with Blaze's parents, who I think you interviewed for the book?
I
Um,
did interview them. Yeah,
did you try to interview Sam's parents?
I did. They wouldn't talk to me. I tried to interview Sam in jail. He wouldn't talk to me. They haven't talked to the parents haven't talked to anyone as far as I know. As
Yeah,
you
me
know,
neither.
they both took the stand at some length, and Sam himself took the stand, so got some stuff from the trial.
Yeah. Jill Smith asks, how do these neo-Nazis and white supremacists reconcile Trump having Jewish relatives and Vance having an Indian wife?
Yeah, well, there's some white supremacists who don't forgive either Trump or Vance for those. There's some who say, I don't support Trump because of the Jews. I don't because of the Kushners. I don't trust him for that. Mason is not one of them. He tries to talk them into supporting Trump despite the Jews. There are others who don't like Vance because of the Indian wife. That's too much for them. That shows the depths of the hatred even among some of them. Um, yeah, there are others who are willing to willing to overlook those sins, as it were.
But also some of the leaders of these groups are minorities themselves or have minority, parents.
Yeah, especially you have the Hispanic, you have the white Hispanics. Of course, you can be both Hispanic and white, but especially you have with the Proud Boys, you have Enrique Tarrio, who is both Hispanic and white. So there's a fair number in that category, which is a bit surprising, but not. He's a charismatic guy and he has his followers. Yeah.
How do they explain it? Do
I
they
think
just say,
that I think they would say that being Hispanic, I think they would sort of say it the same way the Census Bureau would say it in a weird way, that being Hispanic is not a race, sort of maybe the same
hmm,
way yeah, that you can be white, that's in it's ethnicity, not a race.
hmm.
It sort of gets to is Judaism a race or religion? Yeah, these are sort of man-made concepts, and they've constructed their own definitions.
There's a couple questions here about Jewish support for Trump.
Yeah,
What do you make of that, and how do you what's happening there in terms of how do you sort of square that with the what you see as a connection between Trump and Trump's rhetoric and Jew hatred?
yeah. Well, look, it's a complicated issue. I mean, obviously, a lot of it revolves around Israel and his support for Israel, his relationship with Netanyahu. So, for among the most diehard Jewish supporters of Israel itself in Gaza and those who are the most supportive of Netanyahu, they're going to be perhaps the most closely aligned with Trump. Um, that's become a bit harder as the war ground on in Gaza, at least before the ceasefire. So I think the war strained even some of his biggest supporters, and the campus protests added yet another dimension to testing, those relations, and where you stood. Become, it's become a complicated time. I mean, and with the campus protests, then you have Trump waging war against all the universities, and in my view, pretending. I use that word, um, conscious of what I'm saying, but pretending to be a friend of the Jews. I don't know many people who think that he is really legitimately all that concerned about anti-Semitism on campuses when he's waged war against Harvard or Columbia or any of the others. Just the news today with Harvard, and anti-Semitism on campus. It seems to be, as much as anything, a pretext for just waging war against the intellectual elite. I know you may have viewers who might disagree on that. It's a bit of an unknowable thing, but he clearly wants to decimate those universities any way he can. And the anti-Semitism charge seems to be in my view, a convenient tool for him to do that. And shutting down the protests and the free speech has also been a way to do that. That's a very, very complicated issue. We could spend an hour just sort of talking about and debating that. But what I think is much clearer than that is that the situation in Gaza has certainly unleashed a whole nother round of hate crimes on U.S. soil, against Jews, very sadly, against Muslims as well, not quite to that extent, at least lately. There were a lot of anti-Muslim crimes towards the beginning, you'll remember, in Vermont, and the horrible one in Chicago. Lately, we've had far more against Jews. The two Israeli staffers who were killed, the young couple. We had the one in Colorado last summer. I'm forgetting one other big one. There was a third one, the one against Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania, the arson. So there's been, it's that is clear. We can argue about Trump and going against the colleges and all that, but it's certainly crystal clear in my mind that there's been, the FBI data that just came out a few months back. There was sort of flattening against many groups in the hate crimes, but anti-Semitism is continuing to go up sharply, mostly because of Gaza. So, that's very, very worrisome.
There's a question here, which reminded me of something in your book, which is that two things. One is that some of these neo-Nazis are in the military.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a whole book to be written on that.
Yeah.
So my question is, are you going to write that book next? But
Well, there's some of that in this book. Yeah, I'm sure
yeah.
there is an entire book to be written on
And
that. That's a deep-seated issue going back many, many years. There have been horrible hate crimes at Fort Bragg, for instance,
yeah,
down in San Diego at Pendleton. One of the guys who I write about in the book, who was in Orange County for a while, he's an ex-military guy, who was in a white power band in Orange County, where there's a huge white power scene, music scene, was responsible for really the first big mass hate crime slaughter of this period that we're in right now, which was in Wisconsin. He went off to Wisconsin and murdered, let loose with an AR-15 at an Indian Sikh temple, and killed, I believe it was 7 people there. And that was really the first crime like that. Nothing like that had ever happened before. Now we've had a whole bunch of those. And he was ex-military. Um, and Yeah, there's certainly a pocket. I'm not by any means saying that it's, the majority of military, but it's a concerning deep pocket of military guys, and they're recruited by white supremacists because they obviously have a skill set that the white supremacists crave. Adam Offen was founded by a military reservist in Florida who was an active National Guard. He was a nuclear physicist, had a whole cache of explosives in his condo in Florida. That's the guy who founded Adam Offen. We saw it certainly on January 6th that there were tons and tons of both active duty and retired military veterans there that day. You look at many hate crimes, there are either active duty or ex-vets who are involved. I could go on and on with that, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's a concerning, and the military's own policies have been inadequate in that. There was just an embarrassing story that came out a few months ago where the Coast Guard they retracted this after all the blowback, but it was going to be allowed to display the swastika at the Coast Guard under a new policy, and then after the blowback, they said maybe that's not a good idea. But for a long time, I believe this is still the policy. Being in a white supremacist organization was not prohibited under DoD policy so long as you weren't active as part of that. So it was this nebulous, vague definition of what it meant to be active as opposed to in an organization. So it was this gray area that allowed people to sort of sit in that in-between area and still continue to have affiliations with known white supremacist groups, and many of them did and do have those affiliations.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, but I do want to get this question off, which is the Trump Justice Department, and just the FBI in general, was kind of dismantled when it came to pursuing these groups. But it seemed like after the Blaze Bernstein case happened, or when maybe one of a few of these murders started happening, they started taking white supremacy more seriously. Like,
They
how would
did,
you
yeah.
describe sort of the state of affairs in the Justice Department now?
Yeah, I mean, there was a period in around well, 2017, 2018, 2019, um, uh, ironically, when Trump was actually in office, um, that Chris Wray was the director of the FBI with a somewhat tenuous relationship with Trump. When the FBI did seem to be taking these domestic extremist groups, white supremacist groups, much more seriously. They officially shifted their priorities towards these groups after years and years where terrorism, foreign terrorism, had been the clear priority. They recalibrated towards these domestic groups, really out of necessity, because you had these whole sequence. I went through a bunch of them earlier. You had like South Carolina, the church shooting at the first AME. You had the El Paso Walmart. You had Buffalo. You had, and on and on. You had the Pittsburgh Tree of Life. How could you not, right? How could you not recalibrate? And they did, and those are all domestic extremists, almost all of them white supremacists. So it was sort of out of necessity. um, Now that's really just gone completely by the wayside, and it's all immigration now. Look, turn on the TV, look at your computer. And there was I would say, a really embarrassing performance a couple of weeks ago by the head of the National Security Division at the Trump FBI under Kash Patel, where he was asked about what the main threat is now in their estimation, and he said it was Antifa. And he was asked what to define what or who Antifa is and where they're based, and he really couldn't even answer the most basic questions about what that threat constituted. And here he was saying it was the biggest threat. So he was really kind of ripped apart by the Democrats on that in even making the claim that they're the biggest threat.
You got time for one more question?
Sure, sure, whatever you got.
So this is, I think, worth going into a little bit, which is, can you discuss sort of the relationship between Christian nationalism and white supremacy?
Sure, there's definitely a direct connection. Someone like James Mason, who we've talked about a fair amount, considers himself a Christian identity nationalist. Um, Many of them would consider themselves to be Christian white supremacists. I mean, there's a direct connection to the church. And the 14 words of the white supremacists that they rally around in terms of their vow to preserve and protect the identity of the white man. So what they see as an existential threat is a threat to the Christian white man. And so and that's also to the Christian straight white man. So when Sam Woodward was killing Blaze Bernstein, it was the main charge. He was the hate crime charge against him was because he was gay. They didn't specifically charge because he was Jewish. There was more evidence it was because he was gay. So, the neo-Nazis, being gay is a capital offense if you're a neo-Nazi. So the Christian white man is protecting against gays, against non-whites, against non-Christians, everything that runs against that.
Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you everyone
My
for
pleasure.
joining us and for such great questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your
This book
interest.
again is called American Reich, A Murder in Orange County, Neo-Nazis and a New Age of Hate.
Yes.
Go pick it up. Publisher Little Brown. And Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'll put in one plug. If you want a signed copy from me, you can text or email me. My Eric Lichtblau at gmail.com. My first name, last name at gmail.com. If you'll allow me that small plug.
Okay, great.
First name, last name at gmail.com.
I may hit you up for one, although my book is already heavily annotated, so you may have to be fighting for space.
I'd be
Thank you.
glad to.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
reading the forward, for joining us, and hopefully see you at the next one.
Thank you. Thanks for all the great questions.